Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, Chair, Councillors and Officers. My question concerns SYPA's fiduciary duty and its alignment with the urgent need to divest from entities complicit in Israel's violations of international law in Palestine. Recent disclosures confirm SYPA holds 118 million arms manufacturers and 4.8 million Israelis investment, of which 1.9 comprises Israeli government bonds, initiated in 2024 amid the International Court of Justice genocide investigation. These investments directly contradict SYPA's responsible investment policy, which mandates the investments to do no harm. SYPA has consistently cited fiduciary duty and operational constraints within the Border Coast Pension Partnership as barriers to divestment. I argue this interpretation is legally incomplete, financially unsound, and ethically indefensible. SYPA's narrow view of fiduciary duty ignores material risk. Continuing investment in companies implicated in war crimes expose the SYPA to legal challenges under international law, including the Rome Statute, which is applicable via the United Kingdom's International Criminal Court Act of 2001. The UN has explicitly called on states to severe economic ties with Israel, noting complicity risk. SYPA has no mandate for investing members' money in companies property from genocide or Israeli government bonds. The 7,000-strong petition, including signatures of over 700 scheme members, collected in a short space of time, along with recent polling of the UK general public, supporting an arms embargo and the sanctions of Israel, strongly suggest that members would oppose these investments. SYPA has recently also conducted a survey of scheme members, which has yet to publish fully, but which may further demonstrate member sentiment. SYPA has a fiduciary duty to take account of the views and the interests of members, some of whom may have been harmed morally or directly through these investments. Councils like Manchester, Bristol, and Islington have divested from similar assets, proving fiduciary duty accommodates ethical divestment. SYPA claims divestment requires unanimous agreement from all 11 Border Coast funds. However, this misrepresents options. SYPA can work with Border Coast to create exclusionary pool funds to segregate contentious assets to phase divestments. Other pools, e.g. Brunel, have engineered such solutions for climate goals. As part of the 64 billion pool, SYPA holds influence to determine ethical screens, withholding further investments until exclusion policies align is a legitimate fiduciary tool. SYPA retains control over 20% of its portfolio, including Israeli government bonds. Divesting these immediately is wholly within SYPA's power. SYPA's funding level stands at 159%, far above liabilities. Arms investments constitute just 1% of total assets. Divesting this fraction poses no material risk to members' benefits but mitigates long-term reputational and legal harm, as has been previously noted. Divestment is morally, legally, and financially justifiable given this buffer. Continuing these investments violates SYPA's own policies and legal norms. The International Criminal Court's investigation into Gaza's atrocities, coupled with ICG rulings on plausible genocide, escalates the legal peril of inaction. Fiduciary duty requires SYPA to conduct an immediate fiduciary risk assessment evaluating legal, reputation, and financial exposure from these holdings. Demand Border Coast to establish an exclusion scheme for companies on the UN list of settlement violators and arms suppliers to Israel. Divest directly held Israeli bonds and reinvest in local impact initiatives, e.g. South Yorkshire Debt Fund, that align with SYPA's place-based strategy. My question to the authority that should be answered directly and not as part of the general amalgamated response is, given the legal, financial, and ethical imperatives, will SYPA commit by December 2025, number one, to immediately divest its 1.9 million in Israeli bonds from its directly managed portfolio, two, commission an independent fiduciary risk assessment of all Israeli-linked holdings, including BAE Systems and Rolls-Royce, evaluating continued investment under UK and international law. Three, formally table a motion to the next Border Coast meeting to create an exclusion policy for companies complicit in human rights abuses. Silence is complicity. Fiduciary duty is not a shield for inaction, it is a mandate to protect members' interests holistically. The world is watching South Yorkshire Pensions Authority. We're all watching South Yorkshire Pensions Authority. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
So there are four particular points within the question. The first is a call to immediately divest from Israeli government bonds. Israeli government bonds are not held directly by SYPA. These are held within Border Coast Multi-Asset Credit Fund as part of a mandate run by PIMCO. As this is a pooled fund with multiple investors, we are not able to divest from any individual holdings. We have been engaging with Border to Coast over the course of several months to understand PIMCO's rationale for the purchase of their Israeli government bond holdings, the ESG risks associated, and the risks that PIMCO took account of as part of their evaluation and their continuing choice to retain these assets. To date, we've been extremely disappointed by the lack of detailed insight and transparency provided to Border to Coast by PIMCO. We've expressed our concerns to Border to Coast and are actively working to obtain more credible responses from PIMCO. The second point was about commissioning an independent fiduciary risk assessment. Border to Coast and its underlying managers carry out risk assessments as part of their investment process and ongoing monitoring. More details on the approach can be found within Border to Coast's responsible investment policy, which is publicly available. As one of the largest funds in the LGPS, it would be expected that the South Yorkshire Pension Fund would have holdings in many large multinational companies. The holdings identified are managed by the Border to Coast Pension Partnership, who engage with companies to ensure that they are making appropriate assessments of the implications of their operations in conflict-affected areas. The authority does not invest in companies associated with the manufacture of controversial weapons, such as cluster munitions and landmines. These are subject to various international restrictions, and this is a very common position in the pensions industry. However, investment managers can and do invest in major defence contractors, such as BAE Systems, where there is a financial case for doing so. Indeed, companies supplying arms will be doing so under the explicit terms of licences from the relevant government, and it would be unreasonable in terms of the legal principle known as Wednesbury to disinvest in a company acting with specific legal sanction. Third point was about formally tabling a motion at the next Border to Coast Joint Committee meeting. Decisions taken by Border to Coast and their underlying managers regarding the investment risk from a company's ESG activities need to reflect the financial materiality of the issues. Revenues from Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories for the investee companies that have been referenced in the question are unlikely to be financially material in making decisions on investment or disinvestment. As noted previously, companies exporting arms and military technology do so under very strict licence conditions imposed by domestic governments. Further, the Supreme Court held in its judgment on the Palestine Solidarity Campaign case that it is not appropriate for political preference, whether local or national, to take precedence over what is required under a pension scheme's fiduciary duty. As touched upon in the response to the first point, the Pensions Authority does not directly own the shares and bonds of individual companies and government entities, rather invest largely through pooled funds which are ultimately managed by Border to Coast. It's worth noting that the Brunel approach, which effectively relies on segregated accounts that was referenced in the question, has been rejected by the government, and that pool will effectively be discontinued in the coming months. The authority encourages engagement by Border to Coast with investee companies to ensure that they are fully considering the impact of their activity in conflict-affected areas through appropriate risk assessment. The standards which are expected of companies are set out in the collectively agreed responsible investment policy. SYPA has identified that this is an area where they would wish to see policy tightened in future and will be lobbying for this in the next annual review. In addition, the chair of SYPA has raised at the Border to Coast Joint Committee the need to actively address these issues on a number of occasions.
Thank you, George. Question 2 is from Ms. Smith, please.
Thank you.
Sorry, would you mind not standing in front of the camera? Thank you.
As a member of South Yorkshire Pensions Authority in receipt of a pension, I completed the member survey, and it's shocking to me that South Yorkshire Pension Authority have taken so long to provide any sort of information about the outcome of that survey and have not taken the trouble to provide me as a member with any information about when or how the results of the survey will be disseminated or acted upon. In a brief summary of the results of the Responsible Investment Survey published on the SYPA website, 90% of members stated that they wanted clear, transparent communication about how their pensions are invested. In spite of this call for clear communication, SYPA has failed to communicate the results of the Responsible Investment Survey with members. As a member myself, I was not informed that a summary of results was published on the website. Moreover, the summary is incomplete. It entirely fails to report the results of questions related to the arms trade. This is a significant omission, especially when over 700 SYPA members signed a petition to SYPA, as you know, explicitly demanding divestment from arms company complicit in the genocide of Gaza. SYPA is duty-bound to consider the views of members in its decision-making, yet it is failing to reveal what those views actually are to members themselves. What practical steps will SYPA take to rectify its lack of transparency in regard to member survey results, and how will it ensure accountability to members in its implementation of the outcome of survey results? Secondly, as far as I can see, there is no information on the website about the extremely serious concerns raised at the last meeting about the fact that SYPA holds investments in Israeli government bonds. This surely must be a matter of grave concern to each of you who sit as councillors, as members of SYPA. And I would have thought that each of you would be concerned to raise questions about this investment. I therefore request a detailed explanation of how this investment came about and what steps are being taken to cease all investment in Israeli government bonds. I note the answer to the first question that I've just seen. Some of you may be aware of Shir Hefer, an internationally renowned political economist, Israeli, who has recently spoken about the risks to anybody holding Israeli government bonds, as well as the ethical and moral issues concerned. His assessment is the state of the Israeli economy is such that there is no chance that these government bonds will be repaid in the future. So even if moral, ethical concerns are not a concern to members here, then surely the risks. I note what the communication has been in Borders to Coast. I think as a matter of urgency, this authority needs to do something about this completely intolerable and financially risky situation that SYPA finds itself in.
Thank you for your question, Ms Smith. Response please, George.
Yeah. So the authority undertook its responsible investment survey to inform work being undertaken on the investment strategy review and its next annual review of its responsible investment policies. Both of these pieces of work are due to report back to the authority in March 2026. It had been intended to publish the full results alongside these pieces of work, although a summary of the results was published on the website as a news story during August, after authority members had been briefed on the results. Following interest from scheme members, the full results, as provided by the external market research company that undertook the work, have been published on the website. They're available on the responsible investment pages. It should be understood that this is not a referendum, but a piece of research which establishes to some degree the views of a self-selecting sample of scheme members on a range of issues. The authority's duty is to consider these views as part of its overall decision-making process and act in the best interests of all scheme members, avoiding material financial impact on the returns achieved for scheme members. As indicated in the answer to the previous question, officers of the authority continue to pursue answers in relation to the fund manager's rationale for investment in Israeli government bonds. To date, no satisfactory answer has been received, and we continue to pursue this vigorously. When a satisfactory answer is received, it will be published.
Thank you, George. Question 3 is from Finn Cross. My understanding is that Finn is unable to attend. I'm going to ask George to read out both the question and the response.
So the question is, I understand North Yorkshire Pension Fund has moved to remove its holdings in UK equities, and as a result of that process no longer holds shares in Shell or BP. Is this something that SYPA would consider, and if not, why not? So North Yorkshire has recently divested from Border to Coast UK listed Alpha Fund. For information, this is not the same UK equity fund that the Pensions Authority is invested in, although there's clearly an overlap in holdings between the two. We understand from colleagues at North Yorkshire that this divestment was part of a change to their long-term investment strategy, and it wasn't a decision related to holdings in BP and Shell. Essentially, North Yorkshire made this change to help de-risk its portfolio as a result of its increased funding level. The proceeds were invested into a bond fund, which is expected to have a lower risk return profile than equities. The Pensions Authority is in the early stages of reviewing its own long-term investment strategy and expects to recommend an updated investment strategy to the authority in March 2026. This will primarily focus on the risk and return profile of investments, cash flow and liquidity considerations, and climate considerations and net zero alignment. It's worth noting the authority's view that engagement with energy companies is more effective than divestment when it comes to having real-world impact. As a responsible investor, we are able to engage with companies and utilise our shareholder rights to vote at companies' annual general meetings. This gives us a voice at the table, which we can use to try and sway company management. If we divest from these companies, we think it's important to keep in mind the following. We lose our voting rights, our seat at the table's gone. By divesting from energy companies like Shell and BP, we may be making a statement, but we would not actually be denying these companies capital. The shares we sell would immediately be bought by another investor, perhaps an investor less focused on the transition to a lower emission world than SYPA. Divesting from energy companies will make SYPA's own portfolio emissions figures look better, but it doesn't have any impact on actual global emissions. We want to see our portfolio emissions reduce over time, but via a route whereby the larger emitters are actually moving to a more sustainable approach themselves, rather than simply selling our holdings in those companies. That's how we believe we can make a real-world difference.
Thank you, George. Question 4 is from Richard Burnham.
Thank you. In the minutes of the committee meeting Thursday 13th of March, point 15b states that the committee requested officers review the impact of SYPA advocating for active exclusion where engagement had demonstrably failed and provide the results in a report at the 18th of December meeting. When a decision is made that engagement has demonstrably failed, as is clearly the case for Shell and BP, how will the South Yorkshire Pensions Authority work with Borders and Coast to facilitate exclusion of these companies from SYPA's holdings? What steps will SYPA take to encourage partner funds within Borders and Coast to follow suit in excluding Shell and BP?
Thank you. George?
The work to respond to the authority's resolution at its March meeting is ongoing. It's too early in the process, really, for us to identify whether the result will be a decision or advice to promote disinvestment in specific cases, and that will be a decision taken by members of the authority in due course anyway. Given the way in which the investment pooling process works, while SYPA might advocate for disinvestment in particular circumstances, it isn't able to implement such a policy in relation to its holdings in pooled investment vehicles. And therefore, the implementation of such a policy will depend on the authority's ability to build alliances with other partner funds. The likelihood of being able to successfully build such alliances will form a consideration in the advice which officers provide to members at the authority meeting in December.
Thank you, George. That concludes item 8.